The entrance to La Maison was a towering display of affluence. An ornate glass door flanked by gold accents, a crimson carpet leading into an impeccably curated dining room. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer, glancing at Evelyn, whose sleek black dress reflected her quiet elegance. The couple exchanged a look of shared anticipation, their years of experience as culinary critics sharpening their sense of the atmosphere. "Ready?" Evelyn asked softly, her eyes scanning the grand facade. "As ever," Marcus replied, his lips curving into a faint smile. They stepped through the door, their heels clicking against the polished marble floor. A host in a sharp suit greeted them with a neutral expression. "Reservation under Johnson," Evelyn said. The host's gaze flickered over them briefly before nodding. "Of course. Right this way." It was the first time that evening they felt the subtle weight of scrutiny, a sensation neither of them was unfamiliar with. But it was the way Trevor, their waiter, approached them at the table that solidified the tone of the night. "Good evening," Trevor said, his voice clipped as he set 2 water glasses down with a deliberate clink. His eyes barely met theirs before darting toward the room behind them. "Can I get you something to drink, or—" Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "We'd like to see the menu first, if you don't mind." Trevor gave a thin smile, almost a smirk, and disappeared without a word. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Did you catch that?" "I caught it," Evelyn replied, her tone steady but tinged with irritation. "Let's not jump to conclusions yet." Trevor returned moments later, placing a single menu in the middle of the table. "Here you go. Specials are on the back." Evelyn picked up the menu, frowning. "Do you have a second menu?" Trevor hesitated, his expression unreadable. "That's all we've got for now. Maybe the printer was down. Maybe," Marcus said coolly, though the sharp glance he exchanged with Evelyn spoke volumes. As they skimmed the menu, Trevor hovered by a nearby table, his demeanor transforming. He greeted the diners there with warmth, offering detailed recommendations and even suggesting wine pairings. It was a stark contrast to his icy indifference toward the Johnsons. When Trevor returned, Evelyn decided to test the waters. "I noticed you mentioned wine pairings at the other table. Could you suggest something for us as well?" Trevor's smile tightened. "The house red is fine for most of the items here," he said dismissively. "Just fine?" Evelyn asked, her tone light but pointed. Trevor's eyes flickered, briefly betraying his irritation. "If you'd like something more specific, I'd recommend asking the sommelier. And could you call them over for us?" Marcus added, his voice calm but firm. Trevor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he folded his arms and let out a small laugh. "I'll see if they're available." He walked off without another glance. Evelyn sighed, her fingers tapping lightly against the stem of her water glass. "This isn't just inattentive service, Marcus. This is something else." "It's intentional," Marcus replied. "But let's see how far he's willing to take it." The next hour unfolded as a slow unraveling of professionalism. When the appetizers arrived, they were placed on the table without ceremony, and the plating, a hallmark of La Maison, was sloppier than expected. Trevor didn't check on them once during the course, nor did he refill their water glasses. Meanwhile, every other table received attentive, borderline fawning service. It wasn't until the main courses were served that Evelyn decided to speak up. "Trevor," she said, catching his attention as he breezed past their table. "Yes," he replied, the impatience in his tone barely masked. "I couldn't help but notice the discrepancy in service between our table and others," she said evenly. "Is there a reason we're not receiving the same level of attention?" Trevor's lips twitched, and for a moment, his true feelings broke through. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, though his tone was anything but genuine. Evelyn tilted her head. "I think you do." Trevor glanced around, perhaps checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a condescending murmur. "Look, I don't know what you expected coming here, but maybe this place just isn't your speed." The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, silently signaling him to stay calm. "We'll keep that in mind," Marcus said after a beat, his voice steady but cold. Trevor straightened, his smirk returning as he walked away. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "He's testing us?" And he's going to fail, Marcus said. When dessert was offered to other tables, Trevor conveniently skipped theirs. Marcus flagged down a busboy, who awkwardly explained that Trevor had claimed the kitchen was running low on options. Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes as she turned to Marcus. They must think we're fools. The moment of confrontation came when Marcus asked to speak with the manager. Trevor returned instead, a smug expression plastered across his face. Something wrong? He asked, feigning concern. Yes, Marcus said, his tone razor-sharp. We've observed how the staff operates, and it's clear that your treatment of us tonight has been anything but professional. Trevor shrugged. I'm sorry if you feel that way, but… No, Evelyn interrupted. It's not a matter of how we feel. It's a matter of how you've chosen to treat us. And before you attempt another excuse, know that we're documenting everything. For the first time, Trevor's smirk faltered. Documenting? Marcus leaned forward slightly. We've made a career out of evaluating establishments like this. But tonight, we've been forced to assess more than just the food. Trevor's face darkened. If you're trying to threaten me, Trevor, Evelyn cut in, her voice calm but deadly. Consider this a courtesy. We're informing you that your behavior has been noted and will be addressed. The waiter said nothing as he stormed off, leaving the Johnsons to finish their meal in silence. Marcus and Evelyn shared a quiet moment of reflection, their determination steeled. This isn't over, Marcus said softly. Not by a long shot, Evelyn replied. The couple's resilience shone through the humiliation, their dignity intact despite Trevor's best efforts. Little did the staff of La Maison know, their actions that night would soon be exposed for the world to see. Marcus tapped his pen against his leather-bound notebook, the rhythmic sound barely audible over the hum of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. Evelyn had pulled out her phone, ostensibly checking emails, but her fingers weren't moving. Instead, her eyes were fixed on Trevor, who stood at the bar chatting animatedly with a colleague. The contrast between his casual demeanor and the tense atmosphere at their table was almost comical. Marcus sighed, setting the pen down. He doesn't even care to pretend at this point. No, Evelyn said quietly, her voice firm. He doesn't. And that makes this even more important. Trevor finally returned, carrying their entrees on mismatched plates. For a restaurant famed for its immaculate presentation, the sight of an uneven smear of sauce and a jagged piece of garnish felt like an insult. Trevor placed the dishes down with a lack of ceremony, his eyes sliding past them as if they were invisible. There you go, he said, straightening up. Enjoy. Trevor, Evelyn said, her voice sharp enough to make him pause. Can we speak with the sommelier? We've been waiting quite a while for that. Trevor shrugged. He's busy with more pressing requests. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. And what does that mean exactly? Trevor met her gaze for the first time that evening, his expression smug. It means he's busy with tables ordering things that actually pair well with the menu. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You're assuming we wouldn't be capable of appreciating those pairings. Why? Look, Trevor said, holding up his hands as if to ward off an accusation. I don't make the rules. Some people just don't come here to really understand the menu. They come to say they've been to La Maison. Evelyn folded her arms, her gaze piercing. In which category do you think we fall into, Trevor? I wouldn't presume to say, he replied, the corners of his mouth twitching in what might have been an attempt to suppress a laugh. Ah, Marcus said softly, his voice edged with a steeliness that immediately cut through the tension. Then perhaps we should stop presuming altogether. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. Let me know if you need anything else, he said, already turning away. Evelyn's hand shot out, stopping him mid-step. Actually, Trevor, we do need something. The manager. Now. Trevor hesitated, his jaw clenching slightly. Of course. I'll see if they're available. As he walked off, Evelyn turned to Marcus, her voice low but resolute. This isn't incompetence, Marcus. It's contempt. I know, he replied, his tone equally hushed. But I want to see how far he's willing to go before we call it out. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity before a figure approached their table. It wasn't the manager. Instead, it was a younger server who looked visibly uneasy as he adjusted his tie. I'm terribly sorry for the wait, the young man said. "The manager is currently tied up, but I was asked to check in and see if there's anything I can assist you with." Evelyn gave him a measured smile. "Are you aware that Trevor has been dismissive and outright rude since the moment we arrived?" The young man glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting Trevor to materialize at any second. I'm sorry to hear that. Can you?" Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Can you ensure we're treated with the same respect as every other table here tonight? Or is this kind of service part of the training at La Maison?" The server's face flushed, and he stumbled over his words. I'll speak to Trevor and the manager right away." "You do that," Evelyn said, her voice cool, "and let them know that the treatment we're receiving tonight will be noted in our review." The young man paled slightly before nodding and hurrying away. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temple. "I almost feel bad for him," he muttered. "Trevor's got the entire staff walking on eggshells." "That's because they know who his father is," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus looked at her, startled, but she gave him a knowing glance. "I heard one of the other servers whispering about it at the bar. Trevor's untouchable because his father is an investor here." Marcus shook his head, a low chuckle escaping him. "Of course he is. Entitlement wrapped up in nepotism. It's almost cliché." "It's more than that, Marcus," Evelyn said. "It's systemic. Everyone here is enabling him because they're afraid of the consequences. And he knows it." Before Marcus could respond, the manager finally arrived. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, his tailored suit failing to conceal the stress lines etched into his face. He gave them a polite but strained smile. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, is it?" he asked, glancing at their reservation details. "I'm Martin, the floor manager. I understand there have been some concerns about your service tonight." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Concerns? That's putting it mildly." Martin's smile faltered. "I do apologize if the service hasn't met your expectations. Trevor is one of our senior servers, and he has been openly disrespectful and dismissive all evening," Marcus interjected. "It's not a matter of unmet expectations. It's a matter of being deliberately mistreated." Martin's gaze flickered, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. "I'm sure Trevor didn't mean to come across that way. He's been under a lot of pressure lately, and—" "Stop," Evelyn said, her voice sharp. "We're not here for excuses, Martin. We're here because the service we've received tonight has been blatantly discriminatory, and you're brushing it off as if it's a bad day." Martin visibly stiffened. "I assure you, that's not the case. At La Maison, we pride ourselves on inclusivity and excellence in service. If that were true," Marcus said evenly, "we wouldn't be having this conversation." The silence that followed was deafening. Martin opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Before he could recover, Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about Trevor," she said. "It's about a culture that allows someone like him to behave this way without consequence. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to address it, or we will." Martin's face turned ashen, but he nodded stiffly. "I'll speak with Trevor immediately." "Good," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "And while you're at it, consider this. We're food critics. What we publish about tonight's experience will reach far beyond this dining room." Martin looked as if he might faint. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I think we just sent the first tremor through this place." "Good," Evelyn said, her eyes glinting. "It's long overdue." The tension in the dining room had shifted. Marcus and Evelyn could feel it in the way the staff glanced nervously in their direction, whispering behind station counters and darting quick looks toward Trevor. He, however, seemed untouched by the unease, his arrogance undiminished as he swaggered from table to table. The couple waited in silence, letting the weight of their earlier confrontation with Martin hang in the air. The clock ticked, each passing second amplifying the absurdity of Trevor's continued employment. Evelyn folded her napkin with precision. "He's taking his time. He's hoping this will blow over," Marcus said, his gaze fixed on Trevor, who had paused to laugh at a nearby table. "But it won't. Not this time." Finally, Martin returned, looking more frazzled than before. He approached cautiously, as though unsure of how much of their patience remained. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he began, his tone carefully measured. "I've spoken with Trevor. He assures me there was no ill intent in his actions tonight." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "No ill intent? So, the condescension, the neglect, the outright hostility, all of that was accidental." Martin fidgeted, his carefully constructed facade cracking. "I believe Trevor may have misjudged the situation. He's under a lot of stress and—" "Stop," Marcus said, his voice cutting through Martin's excuse like a blade. "This isn't about Trevor's stress. It's about the way he chose to treat us. Do you think we haven't noticed how differently he's behaving with every other table?" Martin opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. "And let's not pretend this is isolated," he continued, his tone steady but sharp. "Because the way the rest of your staff has avoided addressing it tells me this is a systemic problem." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Martin's. Trevor's behavior didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a culture that tolerates, if not outright rewards, people like him. A culture that tells him he can act with impunity because his father signs your checks. Martin paled, his discomfort now unmistakable. He stammered, I assure you, that's not." "It's exactly that," Evelyn interrupted. "And if you think a shallow apology will suffice, you're sorely mistaken." At that moment, Trevor approached the table, his expression defiant. He carried 2 dessert plates, which he set down with a thud, barely glancing at Marcus and Evelyn. "Compliments of the chef," he said flatly, as if the gesture were an obligation rather than an act of contrition. Evelyn stared at the desserts for a moment before looking up at Trevor. "This isn't about dessert, Trevor. It's about your attitude. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Trevor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed he might attempt to defend himself. But then he shrugged. "I already told Martin I didn't mean anything by it. If you're taking it personally, that's not my problem." "Not your problem," Marcus repeated, his tone dangerously calm. "That's your takeaway from all of this?" Trevor smirked. "Look, I do my job. If you don't like how I do it, maybe this isn't the place for you." Evelyn inhaled sharply, her composure slipping for the first time. Marcus placed a hand on hers, silently grounding her. "Trevor," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "do you know who we are?" The question caught Trevor off guard. He hesitated, glancing between them. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we're not just any diners," Evelyn said, her voice regaining its steel. "We're food critics, renowned ones. Our reviews shape reputations, define careers, and close doors. And tonight, you've given us a story the world needs to hear." Trevor's smirk faltered, his confidence visibly wavering. "Critics?" he echoed, the word landing awkwardly in his mouth. "Yes," Marcus said. "In your actions tonight, your deliberate attempts to humiliate us, to remind us we don't belong in your eyes, will not go unnoticed." The color drained from Trevor's face. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Evelyn said, cutting him off. "Because you didn't care. You saw us, made your assumptions, and decided we weren't worth your time or respect. And now you're panicking because you realize how much your behavior is going to cost this restaurant." Trevor looked to Martin for support, but the manager was frozen, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "Don't look at him," Marcus said. "He's part of the problem. If he weren't, this would have been dealt with hours ago." The silence that followed was suffocating. The dining room had grown quieter, the weight of the confrontation drawing the attention of nearby patrons. Evelyn stood, her movements deliberate. "We're done here," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "But before we go, I'd like to speak with the chef. Let him know that while his food was exquisite, it was wasted in an environment poisoned by people like Trevor." Martin nodded hastily. "Of course, I'll get him right away." As Martin scurried off, Trevor remained rooted in place, his bravado completely stripped away. Evelyn met his gaze one last time. "This wasn't just a bad night for us," she said softly, her words cutting deeper than any raised voice. "This was a reckoning for you. Remember that." Trevor said nothing as Marcus and Evelyn sat back down, their dignity intact despite the ordeal. Moments later, the chef arrived, his white jacket pristine, his expression deeply apologetic. "I'm so sorry for what happened tonight," he began, his voice sincere. "This is not what La Maison stands for." Marcus nodded. "We appreciate that. But actions speak louder than words. Let's see what this restaurant is willing to do to make sure this doesn't happen again." The chef nodded solemnly, his face etched with determination. "You have my word. This will be addressed." Evelyn smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We hope so, because the world will be watching." As the couple left the restaurant, the weight of what had transpired settled over them. They knew the battle wasn't over, but for now, they'd done what they came to do: expose the cracks in the system and demand accountability. The article went live 2 days later. Marcus and Evelyn had spent hours refining their review, ensuring every word captured the complexity of their experience. The piece wasn't just about the food, though they praised the chef's technical mastery. It was about the service, the culture of exclusion, and the arrogance that had turned a promising evening into a painful reminder of systemic bias. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. By mid-morning, La Maison's social media pages were flooded with comments. Some expressed shock and disappointment, while others shared their own experiences of subtle, or not-so-subtle, discrimination at the restaurant. Several prominent figures in the culinary world reshared the article, amplifying its reach. Inside the walls of La Maison, the atmosphere had turned hostile. Trevor stood behind the bar, scrolling through his phone with a frown as he read the article's damning description of his behavior. Trevor's arrogance was matched only by his blatant disregard for professionalism, Evelyn had written. His actions reflected not just poor training, but the unchecked entitlement of someone who believes they are untouchable. He slammed his phone onto the counter, startling the bartender next to him. "This is bull," he muttered. "They're overreacting." Martin appeared moments later, his face tight with frustration. "Trevor, we need to talk. Now." Trevor crossed his arms. "What for? I already told you, I didn't mean anything by it. They're twisting this into something it's not." Martin's tone was ice cold. "That's not how it looks to anyone else. The owner is demanding answers, and the staff is on edge. We're losing reservations by the hour. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the entire restaurant." Trevor scoffed. "So what? They'll forget about it in a week. These things always blow over." Martin's expression hardened. "Not this time. You need to apologize publicly, or this could cost us everything." "Apologize?" Trevor's voice rose, incredulous. "For what? For doing my job? For not kissing their feet?" Before Martin could respond, another staff member entered the room hesitantly. It was Miguel, one of the junior servers. "Martin," Miguel said quietly, "some reporters are outside. They're asking about the article. What do we tell them?" Martin rubbed his temples, his frustration boiling over. "Tell them we're reviewing the situation. No statements until I speak to the owner." Miguel nodded and left, but not before casting a wary glance at Trevor, whose defiance seemed unshaken. Meanwhile, Marcus and Evelyn watched the fallout from their apartment. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through dozens of messages from readers. "Another one," she said, holding up her phone. "Someone says they experienced the same kind of treatment at La Maison last year. Apparently, they tried to file a complaint, but it went nowhere." Marcus shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "It's like pulling a thread on a frayed sweater. The more you pull, the more the whole thing unravels." Evelyn set her phone down, her gaze turning thoughtful. "We knew this would make waves, but I didn't expect it to hit so hard so fast." "Neither did they," Marcus replied. "That's why they're scrambling. They thought their reputation was bulletproof, but all it takes is one well-placed shot." As if on cue, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the chef. He wants to talk." "Interesting," Marcus said. "Put him on speaker." Evelyn answered, her tone measured. "Hello, chef. I assume this isn't a casual call." The chef's voice was strained but polite. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to personally apologize again for what happened, and to let you know that changes are already being made." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes?" "We're scheduling immediate diversity and sensitivity training for the entire staff," the chef said. "And we've spoken with Trevor." He's been suspended indefinitely. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Marcus, her skepticism evident. Suspended? Not fired? The chef hesitated. I understand your concerns. And believe me, this is only the beginning. But I'm hoping we can work toward a resolution that satisfies everyone. Marcus's voice turned cold. This isn't about satisfying us. It's about addressing the deeper issue. A suspension feels like a temporary band-aid on a much bigger wound. The chef sighed. You're right, but these things take time. I just wanted you to know we're taking this seriously. Evelyn's voice softened slightly. We appreciate the effort, chef. But understand this, the industry is watching. How you handle this will set a precedent. Not just for your restaurant, but for others like it. After the call ended, Marcus leaned back, his expression unreadable. They're scared. That much is clear. They should be, Evelyn said. But scared isn't enough. They need to change. At the restaurant, the fallout continued. The owner of La Maison, an impeccably dressed man in his 60s named Robert Carlyle, arrived that afternoon. His presence immediately sent a ripple through the staff, who straightened their postures and avoided his gaze. Robert wasted no time, summoning Martin and Trevor to his office. The door closed behind them, and the muffled sounds of raised voices could be heard through the walls. When the door opened again, Trevor stormed out, his face red with anger. He didn't return to the dining floor. Robert emerged moments later, addressing the gathered staff. Effective immediately, Trevor will no longer be part of La Maison. I expect the highest standards from everyone here, and that includes how we treat every guest, regardless of background. Is that clear? The staff nodded, though tension lingered in the air. That evening, Marcus and Evelyn received an email from Robert himself. Subject, a personal apology. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I want to personally extend my deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you received at La Maison. As the owner, I take full responsibility for the failure in service and the systemic issues that allowed it to occur. Trevor's employment has been terminated, and we are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure such behavior is never tolerated again. I hope one day you might consider returning to experience the true essence of what La Maison strives to be. Sincerely, Robert Carlyle. Evelyn read the email aloud, her expression thoughtful. Well, that's a start. Marcus nodded slowly. It is, but we'll see if the actions match the words. As they sat in silence, the weight of what they had set in motion settled over them. They had used their voices to demand accountability, but the fight for true equality in spaces like La Maison was far from over. The days following the fallout from Marcus and Evelyn's review marked a turning point, not just for La Maison, but for the broader conversation about inclusion and equity in fine dining. The story had gone viral, sparking debates across media platforms. Major news outlets picked up the review, while social media exploded with hashtags like #DiningWhileBlack and #LaMaisonAccountability. For Marcus and Evelyn, the days were a whirlwind of interviews, messages of support, and the occasional wave of backlash from defenders of the status quo. Through it all, they remained steadfast, using their platform to emphasize the broader implications of their experience. Do you feel vindicated? A reporter asked during a television segment. Evelyn answered carefully. This isn't about personal vindication. It's about challenging the systems that allow prejudice to persist. We're just one story. There are countless others that never see the light of day. Marcus nodded. This is bigger than us. The question isn't just, how do we fix one restaurant? It's, how do we ensure the entire industry learns from this? Meanwhile, La Maison scrambled to repair its reputation. Robert Carlyle took swift action, holding a press conference to address the controversy. I want to acknowledge the harm caused by the actions of our staff, he began, his tone measured but contrite. As the owner, I failed to ensure that our values of excellence and inclusivity were upheld. For that, I take full responsibility. He outlined the steps the restaurant would take: mandatory diversity and inclusion training, a third-party audit of their hiring and management practices, and a new customer feedback system to ensure accountability moving forward. Despite the promises, the backlash was far from over. Activists called for greater transparency, and former employees began sharing their experiences online. many echoing Marcus and Evelyn's claims of a toxic culture. For Trevor, the consequences were immediate and severe. His name and face had been circulated online, and the public was unforgiving. News of his termination did little to quell the outcry against his behavior, and soon after, he deactivated all his social media accounts. Trevor's father, a silent investor in the restaurant, also faced pressure. Community leaders called for him to step down, arguing that his son's behavior reflected poorly on his judgment and values. Within weeks, he quietly sold his stake in La Maison, distancing himself from the scandal entirely. Months later, Marcus and Evelyn received an invitation in the mail. It was from Robert Carlyle, inviting them to return to La Maison for a private dinner. "Do you think we should go?" Evelyn asked, holding the envelope between her fingers. Marcus hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me feels like going would undermine what we stood for. And part of me thinks it's worth seeing if they've truly changed," Evelyn countered. After a long discussion, they decided to accept. The night of the dinner, Marcus and Evelyn approached La Maison with cautious optimism. From the moment they entered, it was clear the atmosphere had shifted. The staff greeted them warmly, their body language devoid of the stiffness they'd noticed before. The chef himself welcomed them at the door, a broad smile on his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming. It means the world to us to have the chance to show you what La Maison can truly be." Throughout the evening, the couple noted subtle but significant changes. The staff was attentive without being overbearing, and the energy in the dining room felt inclusive rather than exclusive. Robert Carlyle joined them for dessert, his demeanor humble but confident. "We still have a long way to go," he admitted, "but I hope tonight has shown you that we're committed to doing better." Evelyn sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's not just about how you treat us tonight. It's about how you treat every guest moving forward." Robert nodded. "Understood, and we'll keep working to prove that." On their way home, Marcus and Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought them there. "I think they're genuinely trying," Marcus said, staring out the car window. "They are," Evelyn agreed. "But it's not about one restaurant changing. It's about the entire industry waking up to the fact that exclusivity doesn't mean exclusion." Marcus glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're thinking about writing a book, aren't you?" Evelyn chuckled. "Maybe. This experience has taught me that there's so much more to say. Not just about food, but about the spaces we create and who we allow to feel welcome in them." "I'd read that," Marcus said with a grin. As the months passed, the changes at La Maison began to ripple outward. Other restaurants took notice, implementing their own diversity training and auditing their hiring practices. Marcus and Evelyn's review became a touchstone in the industry, sparking conversations about bias and inclusion that extended far beyond New York. For Marcus and Evelyn, the experience reaffirmed their mission as critics. They weren't just evaluating food. They were holding an entire culture accountable, one meal at a time. And while the road ahead was long, they knew they had taken a step towards something greater, a dining world where everyone could sit at the table and no one was made to feel they didn't belong.